The young woman collapsed in the dusty street of Fort Bowie, Arizona. Her pale face turned toward the merciless August sun, and the crowd that gathered around her whispered the same words they had spoken since she arrived 2 weeks earlier with her late aunt's belongings. Genevieve Miller had traveled from Boston in the summer of 1878, carrying little more than a worn trunk and the deed to a small plot of land her deceased aunt had left her. The journey west had taken everything from her already fragile constitution, leaving her thin as a reed and weak from weeks of poor food and rattling stagecoach rides. Her auburn hair, once carefully pinned, hung in limp strands against her neck, and her green eyes held a determination that her body could not match. Warren Whitlock pushed through the gathered townspeople with the easy authority of a man accustomed to taking charge. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders straining against his buckskin shirt, and his muscled arms showed years of hard labor in the mountains. Dark hair fell past his collar, and his face bore the weathered tan of someone who lived more with nature than civilization. He had come into town from his cabin in the nearby Chiricahua Mountains to trade furs and stock up on supplies, but now he knelt beside the unconscious woman with surprising gentleness for such a large man. "Someone get Doc Harrison," he commanded, his deep voice brooking no argument. He scooped Genevieve into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all, her slight frame almost disappearing against his chest. "Where does she live?" An older woman in a faded calico dress pointed toward a dilapidated cabin at the edge of town. That was Martha Collins' place before she passed. "This is her niece from back east. Been trying to fix it up, but she is barely strong enough to lift a bucket of water. We all said she should go back where she came from. The frontier is no place for a woman so delicate." Warren carried Genevieve toward the cabin, his long strides eating up the distance quickly. The small structure was in worse shape than he had expected, with gaps in the walls and a roof that clearly leaked. Inside, the single room held a sagging cot, a rickety table, and little else. He laid her carefully on the cot, noting how her breathing came shallow and quick. Doc Harrison arrived minutes later, his medical bag in hand. He was a grizzled man in his 60s who had seen every ailment the frontier could produce. After examining Genevieve, he stood and wiped his spectacles with a handkerchief. "Exhaustion, malnutrition, and probably touched by the sun," he said quietly. "She needs rest, proper food, and someone to look after her. From what I hear, she has been living on almost nothing, trying to make that worthless patch of land produce something." Warren looked down at the unconscious woman, taking in her delicate features and the dark circles under her eyes. Something stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar protective instinct that caught him off guard. He had lived alone in the mountains for the past 8 years, preferring the company of wildlife and solitude to the complications of town life. At 32 years old, he had convinced himself he was content with that existence. "I will look after her," he heard himself say. Doc Harrison raised his eyebrows. You barely come to town once a month. How do you plan to manage that?" Warren crossed his arms over his broad chest. "I will figure it out. Can she be moved?" "Not today. Let her rest. Come back tomorrow and we will see how she fares." The doctor paused at the door. "You know people will talk, Warren," a bachelor mountain man taking in a young woman. "Let them talk," Warren said flatly. He had never cared much for gossip. Genevieve stirred as the evening shadows lengthened across the cabin floor. Her eyelids fluttered open, and confusion filled her green eyes as she focused on the large man sitting in the corner, watching her with an intensity that should have frightened her but somehow did not. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Warren leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. "Name is Warren Whitlock. You collapsed in the street. Doc says you have been running yourself into the ground." She tried to sit up, but her arms trembled with the effort. Warren was beside her in an instant, his large hands steadying her shoulders. The warmth of his touch seeped through the thin fabric of her dress, and she found herself looking up into eyes the color of a stormy sky. "I am fine," she insisted, though they both knew it was a lie. "I just need to rest a bit, then I can get back to work on the land." "What you need is food and proper care," Warren said bluntly. "That land of yours is not going anywhere. When did you last eat a real meal?" Genevieve thought about it and realized she could not remember. She had been rationing her meager supplies, trying to make them last until she could get something growing on the land. "I have some beans left," she said defensively. Warren stood and moved to the cold stove. He examined it with a critical eye, then checked the nearly empty cupboard. His jaw tightened. "Stay there," he ordered, then left the cabin. He returned an hour later with his arms full of supplies. Fresh bread from the bakery, eggs, milk, salted pork, potatoes, and coffee filled the small table. Genevieve watched in amazement as he efficiently built a fire in the stove and began preparing a meal. His large hands moved with practiced ease, and she realized this was not a man who depended on others for his daily needs. "You do not have to do this," she protested weakly. "I can take care of myself." Warren glanced at her over his shoulder, and something in his expression made her fall silent. "Right now, you cannot even stand on your own. Eat what I make you, and we will talk about what comes next." The smell of frying pork and eggs made her stomach clench with hunger. When Warren brought her a plate piled high with food, she tried to eat slowly, but her body demanded fuel. He watched her eat with satisfaction, then ate his own portion standing by the stove. "Doc says you need someone to look after you," Warren said when she finally pushed away the empty plate. "I have a cabin up in the mountains. It is solid, with good water and plenty of game. You can come with me until you get your strength back." Genevieve stared at him in shock. "I cannot possibly go live with a stranger in the mountains. That would be completely improper. Staying here alone and starving is not doing you any favors either," Warren pointed out. "I am not asking you to marry me, just offering a place where you can recover. You can decide what to do with your land once you are healthy enough to think straight." She wanted to refuse, to cling to her independence and the legacy her aunt had left her. But the weakness in her limbs and the memory of collapsing in the street told her she was out of options. Pride would not fill her belly or fix the leaking roof over her head. "Why would you help me?" she asked quietly. "You do not know me." Warren was silent for a long moment. "My sister was about your age when she died. Consumption took her before I could get her somewhere with better air. Maybe if someone had helped her when she needed it, she would still be alive. I cannot help her anymore, but I can help you." The raw grief in his voice touched something deep in Genevieve's heart. She understood loss. Her parents had died in a fire when she was 16, leaving her to live with her stern aunt in Boston. When that aunt had passed last year, her Western sister Martha had seemed like a lifeline. But Martha had died before Genevieve could reach her, and now here she was, alone in a hostile land she did not understand. "Just until I am stronger," she said finally. "Then I will figure out what to do." Warren nodded once, a gesture of agreement that felt as binding as any contract. "We leave in the morning. Get some rest." He settled himself on the floor near the door, his back against the wall. Genevieve wanted to protest that he should take the bed, but exhaustion pulled her under before she could form the words. The next morning, Warren loaded his pack mule with supplies while Genevieve gathered her few belongings. The townspeople watched with barely concealed curiosity as he lifted her onto his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding that stood patiently. She sat sideways in the saddle, and Warren swung up behind her, his arm encircling her waist to keep her secure. "Hold on," he said quietly, and she felt the rumble of his voice through his chest pressed against her back. The ride into the mountains took most of the day. Warren kept the pace easy, stopping frequently to let Genevieve rest. She tried to stay alert and take in the landscape, the towering pines and the rocky outcroppings that spoke of ancient geological forces. But the rocking motion of the horse and the warmth of Warren's body behind her made her drowsy. "You can sleep if you need to," Warren said, feeling her sway. "I have got you." She let her head rest against his shoulder, trusting this stranger in a way that should have frightened her but felt oddly natural. His arm tightened around her waist, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep. When she woke, they were approaching a cabin nestled in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. A stream ran nearby, its water crystal clear and inviting. The cabin was larger than the one in town, built of solid logs chinked with clay. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a covered porch stretched across the front. Warren dismounted and lifted Genevieve down, steadying her until she found her balance. "Welcome to my home," he said simply. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly neat. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with hooks for cooking pots and a small oven built into the stonework. A sturdy table and chairs occupied the center of the room, and shelves held supplies and tools. A rope bed with a thick mattress stood in one corner, covered with what looked like a bearskin. Another corner held a smaller cot. "You will take the bed," Warren said before she could protest. "I will sleep on the cot. There is a root cellar under that trapdoor for food storage, and the stream has the best water you will ever taste." Over the next few days, Genevieve began to understand the rhythm of Warren's life. He rose before dawn, built up the fire, and had coffee brewing before she woke. He hunted and trapped, providing fresh meat that he cooked with surprising skill. He showed her where he kept things, explaining his systems for storing food and supplies. "You need to build up your strength," he said on the third morning, handing her a cup of rich broth. "We will start slow. Today you walk to the stream and back. Tomorrow maybe a little further." Genevieve bristled at being told what to do, but she could not deny the wisdom in his approach. Her legs still trembled after the slightest exertion, and climbing the 2 steps to the cabin porch left her breathless. The walk to the stream took longer than it should have. Warren walked beside her, his long strides shortened to match her pace. He did not rush her or show impatience, just remained a steady presence at her side. "Tell me about Boston," he said as they stood by the water. Genevieve looked out at the mountains rising in the distance. "It is crowded and noisy. Buildings everywhere, people rushing about their business. I worked as a seamstress after my parents died. The work was fine, but I always felt like I was just existing, not living. And you thought coming west would change that. I thought it would give me a fresh start, a chance to build something of my own." She laughed bitterly. "I did not realize how unprepared I was for any of it." Warren picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the stream. "Being unprepared is not the same as being incapable. You just need the right tools and knowledge. That can be learned." Over the following weeks, Warren proved to be a patient teacher. He showed her how to identify edible plants, how to move quietly through the forest, how to read the signs of changing weather. He taught her to shoot his rifle, standing behind her to steady her arms and adjust her aim. The first time she hit the target, his rare smile made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. "Good," he praised, and the warmth in his voice spread through her like sunshine. As her body grew stronger, Genevieve began to take over some of the household tasks. She insisted on doing the cooking, and while her first attempts were mediocre at best, Warren ate everything she prepared without complaint. She washed their clothes in the stream, mended his worn shirts, and organized the cabin with a woman's eye for efficiency. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Warren carved a piece of wood while Genevieve worked on sewing a new shirt for him. The comfortable silence between them had become familiar, and she found herself studying his profile in the firelight. His face was all hard planes and strong features, but she had learned the gentleness hidden beneath that rugged exterior. "You have been here almost a month," Warren said without looking up from his carving. "You are looking healthier. Put on some weight." Genevieve knew he was right. Her dresses fit better now. Her arms had muscle where before there had been only skin and bone, and she could walk for an hour without needing to rest. "I feel stronger," she admitted. "Thank you for that." Warren finally looked at her, his gray eyes intense in the flickering light. "You did the work. I just provided the opportunity." "You provided much more than that," Genevieve said softly. "You gave me hope when I had none." Something shifted in the air between them. Warren set down his carving and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I need to tell you something. These past weeks, having you here, it has changed things for me. I thought I was content being alone, but I realize now I was just hiding from life." Genevieve's heart began to beat faster. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that somewhere along the way, this stopped being about helping you recover and became about not wanting you to leave." He ran a hand through his long hair, looking uncomfortable with the admission. "But you have a life to figure out, and I have no right to ask you to give up your plans." Genevieve set down her sewing and crossed to where he sat. She knelt in front of him, placing her hands on his knees. "What if my plans can change? What if what I thought I wanted is not what I need after all?" Warren cupped her face in his large, calloused hands. "You need to be sure, Genevieve. Life here is hard. Winter in these mountains can be brutal. It is isolated and lonely. You would be giving up any chance at an easier life." "I tried the easier life in Boston," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "It left me empty. Here with you, I feel alive for the first time in years. I do not want to go back to just existing." He searched her face for a long moment, then leaned down and kissed her with a gentleness that made her eyes sting with tears. His lips were warm and firm, and when she kissed him back, she felt his control slip just enough to reveal the depth of feeling he had been holding back. When they finally broke apart, Warren rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said roughly. "I tried not to, but you got under my skin from the first moment I saw you lying in that street." "I love you too," Genevieve whispered. "You saved my life in more ways than one." That night, Warren made up the cot for himself as usual, but the next morning he took Genevieve into town. They stood before the circuit judge who happened to be passing through Fort Bowie, and with Doc Harrison and the baker's wife as witnesses, they spoke their vows. Genevieve wore her best dress, hastily altered to fit her healthier frame, and Warren had trimmed his hair and beard. When he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, she felt a completeness she had never known before. They returned to the mountain cabin as husband and wife, and that night, Warren carried her across the threshold with a reverence that made her feel precious. He made love to her with the same patience he had shown in teaching her everything else, drawing out her pleasure until she cried out his name in wonder. In the days that followed, their partnership deepened in every way. Genevieve continued to grow stronger, and Warren taught her more advanced skills. She learned to hunt small game, to preserve meat for the winter, to raid the forest like a book. He built her a garden plot near the cabin and helped her prepare the soil, though it was late in the season. Together, they planted quick-growing vegetables that would mature before the first frost. When winter came to the mountains, it arrived with a ferocity that tested everything Genevieve had learned. Snow piled high around the cabin, and the temperature dropped until ice formed on the inside of the windows. But Warren had prepared well, and the cabin stayed warm and dry. They passed the long winter nights reading from his small collection of books, playing cards, and talking about everything and nothing. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled like a living thing around the cabin, Warren would hold Genevieve close and tell her stories of his life before they met. He spoke of growing up in Missouri, of coming west after the war, of finding peace in the mountains after seeing too much death and violence. She shared her own stories, the happy memories of her childhood before the fire, the lonely years after, the desperate hope that had brought her west. "Do you regret it?" Warren asked one snowy evening. "Giving up civilization for this?" Genevieve looked around the cabin at the warm fire and the supplies they had worked together to gather, at the strong man who watched her with such love in his eyes. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This is the life I was meant for. I just needed someone to show me I was stronger than I believed." Spring came late to the mountains, but when it finally arrived, it brought an explosion of life. Genevieve worked in her garden with enthusiasm, her hands confident in the soil now. Warren expanded the cabin, adding a second room that would serve as a proper bedroom. He built the furniture with his own hands, each piece crafted with care. As summer approached, Genevieve realized her monthly courses had not come. She said nothing at first, wanting to be certain, but when another month passed and her breasts grew tender, she knew. She chose a quiet evening to tell Warren when they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "I am going to have a baby," she said simply. Warren went very still beside her. Then he turned to her with such joy on his face that she started to laugh. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, his face buried in her hair. "A baby," he repeated in wonder. "Are you well? You need to see Doc Harrison." "I feel wonderful," Genevieve assured him, "strong and healthy and so very happy." Warren placed his large hand on her still flat stomach with reverence. "I will take care of both of you, I swear it." The pregnancy progressed without complication. Genevieve continued her daily activities with Warren hovering protectively nearby, ready to help at the slightest sign of fatigue. As her belly grew round, he built a cradle from smooth pine and carved it with delicate designs of forest animals. He made a trip to town for supplies and returned with soft fabric, which Genevieve sewed into tiny gowns and blankets. In early January of 1880, on a night when fresh snow fell soft and silent outside, Genevieve went into labor. Warren had brought a midwife from town 2 weeks earlier, a capable woman named Mrs. Fletcher, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. She took charge of the situation with brisk efficiency while Warren paced the main room, looking more nervous than Genevieve had ever seen him. The labor was long and difficult, testing Genevieve's hard-won strength. But when dawn broke and she finally held her son in her arms, every moment of pain faded into insignificance. The baby had Warren's dark hair and a healthy set of lungs that he demonstrated with vigor. Warren knelt beside the bed, his eyes suspiciously bright as he looked at his wife and child. "He is perfect," he said hoarsely. "You are amazing." They named him William after Warren's father, and the baby became the center of their world. Warren proved to be a devoted father, patient with the sleepless nights and always ready to help. He carved toys for his son and sang old songs in his deep voice that somehow always soothed the baby's tears. As William grew into a curious toddler, Genevieve often thought back to the woman she had been when she first arrived in Fort Bowie. That fragile, desperate creature seemed like a stranger now. The mountains had made her strong, but it was Warren's patient love that had shown her the strength had been inside her all along. just waiting for the right conditions to flourish. On William's second birthday, Warren surprised Genevieve by producing the deed to her aunt's land in town. "I have been thinking," he said. "That land is rightfully yours. We could sell it and use the money to expand our operation here, maybe get some cattle started or improve the cabin further." Genevieve took the deed and looked at it thoughtfully. "Or we could give it to someone who needs it the way I did, someone looking for a fresh start." Warren smiled and pulled her close. "That is why I love you, always thinking of others." They ended up donating the land to a young couple who had recently arrived from the East, struggling just as Genevieve once had. Warren helped the husband build a proper cabin, teaching him the skills he would need to survive. Genevieve befriended the wife, sharing the knowledge she had gained through her own trials. As the years passed, the Whitlock family grew. 2 years after William came a daughter they named Grace, with her mother's auburn hair and green eyes. Then another son, James, who had his father's quiet strength. The cabin expanded again to accommodate the growing family, rooms added one by one as Warren's skilled hands shaped their home. Genevieve became known throughout the territory as a woman of remarkable capability. People who had once whispered that she was too frail for frontier life now sought her advice on everything from preserving food to treating minor ailments. She taught other women the skills Warren had taught her, passing on the knowledge with the same patience he had shown. Warren's reputation grew as well, not just as a skilled trapper and hunter, but as a man of integrity who could be counted on to help his neighbors. When disputes arose, people often sought his counsel. When someone needed help, he was always willing to lend his strength. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Warren and Genevieve stood on their porch as their children played in the yard below. William, now 9, was teaching his younger siblings how to track animals in the dirt. Grace squealed with delight at something her older brother showed her, while 4-year-old James watched with solemn attention. "You remember what you said to me that first night in my cabin?" Warren asked, his arm around Genevieve's waist. "That you just needed to rest a bit, then you could get back to work on the land." Genevieve laughed at the memory. "I was so stubborn and foolish. I had no idea what I was doing." "You had courage," Warren corrected. "You just needed someone to believe in you until you could believe in yourself." "We saved each other," Genevieve said softly, turning in his arms to face him. "I gave you a reason to rejoin the world, and you gave me the strength to become who I was meant to be." Warren kissed her tenderly, the same way he had on their wedding day. "Best decision I ever made, picking you up off that street. Best decision I ever made, trusting a mountain man who looked scary but had the gentlest heart I have ever known." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors, the Whitlock family gathered for supper. The table Warren had built with his own hands was laden with food from Genevieve's garden and Warren's hunting. The children chattered about their day while their parents exchanged fond glances over their heads. After supper, as was their custom, they gathered by the fireplace. Warren carved while Genevieve sewed, and the children played quietly with the toys their father had made. It was a scene of domestic peace that would have seemed impossible to the desperate woman who had collapsed in Fort Bowie all those years ago. That night after the children were asleep, Warren and Genevieve sat on their porch in the warm summer darkness. The stars shone brilliant overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the moon. "I want another baby," Genevieve said suddenly. Warren turned to look at her in surprise. "Are you certain? 3 is already a handful." "I am certain," she said, taking his hand and placing it over her heart. "I love our life, our family. I want to fill this home with love and laughter. I want to prove every single day that those people who said I was too frail were wrong." Warren pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "You proved that long ago, love. But if you want another baby, then we will have another baby." 9 months later, Genevieve gave birth to twin girls they named Hope and Faith. The cabin erupted into controlled chaos as Warren and the older children learned to manage 2 babies at once. But Genevieve handled it all with the same strength and determination she brought to everything in her life. The twins were 5 years old when a severe drought struck the territory. Water became scarce, and many families struggled to keep their livestock alive. Warren and Genevieve opened their stream to their neighbors, sharing their resources freely. Genevieve showed the other women how to stretch their food supplies, drawing on the lessons she had learned during her own desperate times. When the rains finally came, the community gathered to celebrate, and the Whitlock family was at the center of the festivities. People toasted Warren's generosity and Genevieve's wisdom, marveling at how this woman who had once been written off as too delicate had become a pillar of strength for them all. As the children grew older, they each developed their own strengths and interests. William showed his father's skill with his hands, learning to build and craft with precision. Grace inherited her mother's gift for growing things, coaxing vegetables from the earth with loving care. James had a way with animals that amazed everyone, able to calm the wildest horse with just his voice. The twins, Hope and Faith, were inseparable and showed early signs of their mother's determination and their father's quiet strength. Warren taught all his children to respect the land and the creatures that lived on it. He passed on the skills his own father had taught him, as well as the wisdom he had gained through years of living close to nature. Genevieve taught them to read and write, to calculate numbers, and to think for themselves. Together, they raised children who were both strong and compassionate, capable and kind. On their 20th anniversary, the entire family made a trip to Fort Bowie. The town had grown considerably over the years, with new buildings and businesses springing up along the main street. But the old cabin where Genevieve had once struggled to survive still stood, now occupied by a young family who reminded her so much of herself and Warren in those early days. They visited Doc Harrison, now retired but still sharp as ever. He shook his head in wonder as he looked at Genevieve, surrounded by her healthy, thriving children. "I remember when Warren brought you to me," he said. "I honestly did not think you would make it. You were so weak, so fragile. Look at you now." Genevieve smiled and squeezed Warren's hand. "I had a good teacher. He showed me that strength is not just about physical power. It is about patience, determination, and having someone believe in you." "She was always strong," Warren said quietly. "She just needed the right circumstances to let that strength show." That night, they stayed at the hotel in town, a luxury that made the children's eyes wide with excitement. After the young ones were asleep in their room, Warren and Genevieve walked through the quiet streets hand in hand, ending up at the spot where he had first found her collapsed in the dirt. "Thank you," Genevieve said softly, looking at the dusty street that had changed her life. "For what?" Warren asked, genuinely puzzled. "For seeing past what I appeared to be to what I could become, for having the patience to help me find my strength, for loving me when I could not love myself." Tears sparkled in her eyes. "For giving me this beautiful life I never dreamed possible." Warren cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "You gave me just as much. Before you, I was just existing, hiding in the mountains from the world. You reminded me what it meant to live, to love, to hope for the future. We saved each other, remember?" They kissed under the stars, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, when they needed it most. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. William married a sweet girl from a neighboring ranch and built his own cabin not far from his parents, staying close to the land he loved. Grace became a teacher, bringing education to the remote communities scattered through the mountains. James started a horse breeding operation that became renowned throughout the territory. Hope and Faith, true to their names, became nurses who traveled to wherever they were needed, bringing healing and comfort to those who suffered. As Warren and Genevieve grew older, their love only deepened. They had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, had celebrated triumphs and mourned losses, had built a life together that was richer than either had imagined possible. The cabin had grown into a sprawling homestead, with multiple buildings and cultivated fields, but at its heart remained the simple log structure where they had first learned to love each other. On a warm summer evening in 1910, Warren and Genevieve sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Both were in their 60s now, their hair silver and their faces lined with the marks of a life well lived. But their eyes still sparkled when they looked at each other, and their hands still reached for one another without thought. "You ever think about what would have happened if I had not been in town that day?" Warren asked, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Genevieve considered the question seriously. "I think I would have died," she said bluntly, "or given up and gone back east, which would have been a kind of death. Either way, I would have missed out on the greatest adventure of my life. I would have stayed alone in these mountains, growing old and bitter without even realizing what I was missing," Warren mused. "One chance encounter changed everything." "Not chance," Genevieve disagreed. "Fate. We were meant to find each other. Two broken people who fit together perfectly." Warren pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, a position as comfortable and familiar as breathing. Around them, the sounds of their extended family filled the air. Grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter bright and joyful. William and his wife sat on their own porch nearby, watching their children with the same love Warren and Genevieve had always shown. The other children would arrive tomorrow for the monthly family gathering that had become tradition. "We built something good here," Warren said with satisfaction. "Something that will last beyond us." "We built it together," Genevieve reminded him. "Every step of the way we were partners. That is why it is strong." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Warren and Genevieve remained on their porch, content in each other's company. They had proven that love and patience could overcome any obstacle, that strength came in many forms, and that two people who were willing to work together could build a life beyond their wildest dreams. The young woman who had been dismissed as too frail for frontier life had not only survived but thrived, becoming a woman of legendary strength and capability. And the lonely mountain man who had hidden from the world had opened his heart and found a love that transformed him. Together, they had built a legacy that would endure for generations, a testament to the power of patience, determination, and unwavering love. Years later, when their great-grandchildren asked about the old days, the family would tell the story of how Genevieve and Warren met. They spoke of a time when people said she was too fragile for the frontier, and how a mountain man with strong arms and a gentle heart had shown her that strength was not just given, but built day by day with love and patience. They told of how two lost souls had found each other and created a family, a home, and a love that became the foundation for all who came after. The story always ended the same way, with Warren and Genevieve sitting on their porch at sunset, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating in rhythm. Two people who had found in each other everything they needed to become who they were always meant to be. And every time the story was told, the listeners would nod and smile, recognizing the truth at its heart that love, patience, and determination could overcome any obstacle, and that the strongest foundations were built not in a single moment, but through countless small acts of devotion over a lifetime. The homestead that Warren and Genevieve built together stood for over a century, passed down through their descendants, each generation adding to it while honoring the legacy of the couple who had started it all. The cabin where they had fallen in love remained at the center, preserved as a reminder of where it all began, a testimony to the enduring power of two people who refused to let circumstances define them, and instead chose to define their own destiny together.